the proposed Commonwealth Fiscal Plan for 2024 has changed somewhat from the plans that we've had in the past, in the sense that we are now focused on how do we move past the recovery period. It's important to look backwards to figure out how you want to move forward. In 2018, as part of PROMESA, there was a requirement in the law for the General Accounting Office to issue a report on what were the root causes of the bankruptcy and to make recommendations on how to move forward. That 2018 report is just as relevant today as it was then. It identified 3 root causes of the bankruptcy. The first was inadequate financial management practices. The second was a prolonged economic contraction. And then the third were policy decisions, such as borrowing to fund the balanced budgets and not funding purely the pension funds. These are the things that as we move forward past the bankruptcy, we need to make sure we resolve so that we don't go backwards. We need to establish robust financial management and oversight that is permanent after the board leaves. For economic growth, you had decades of contraction. While we're receiving the federal funds, which are supporting the economy, we need to build underneath that economic growth so that when those funds roll off, it is growing again. So you're not going back to the contraction that existed prior to PROMESA. We are on the way, but we need to move forward. And then the policy decisions, there needs to be a discipline and a recognition by the legislature that policies that cost money, that impact the fiscal plan, actually matter. We're only a year and a half after, almost 2 years out of the bankruptcy from Title III for the Commonwealth. And there's already a return to passing in some of the laws, returning to pension increases and other things that bring us back to what caused the bankruptcy in the first place. So the 2024 fiscal plan is going to highlight the initiatives that we need to address the root causes so that we don't go backwards. Some progress has been made. There is a debt management policy, which includes some controls so that you do not use debt to pay for operating improvements. But there's still this, the constitutional quirk that deals with the issue of whether or not a budget is balanced, right? If you're using any revenues, not just the revenues for that year. PROMESA required that the budgets be balanced according to modified accrual. It is a high standard, but it's an important one. And it's one that was used in New York City post their near bankruptcy and has resulted in New York City being solvent every year since the crisis in the 1970s. Where have we gotten so far? What have we done? Puerto Rico's debt has been reduced dramatically. Prior to the restructuring of the debt, 25 cents of every dollar was being used to pay for debt service. It's an extraordinarily amount and was completely unaffordable. The amount that you're spending to pay for debt is money that you're not spending in education. You're not spending in healthcare. You're not spending in all of the other areas, right? And that contributes to the lack of economic growth, because if you can't spend in those areas, Puerto Rico becomes less attractive, and that leads to the migration and the spiral. So where are we today? 25 cents of every dollar has now been reduced to 6 cents of every dollar. That is well within the amount of debt service that other states have, the rest of the nation, and it's something that is now affordable. And that allows us now to make the investments that are in the governor's budget and that we're talking about submitting today. It is almost a 60% reduction. But again, that is just part of it, because the debt was a symptom of the broader problem, which is financial mismanagement. Since 2018, the Oversight Board has been actively managing the budgets. But again, it's important to look backwards. For the first 16 years of this century, 2000 to 2016. In each year consecutively, the government spent more than they took in revenues. I mean, it's important to understand that is a structural issue with how the finances are managed, and that led to the amount of debt that we had. We've been working with the government to manage the budgets going forward. And in 22, the Commonwealth came out of bankruptcy. Large payments still had to be made in that year for debt service because while they were in Title III, they couldn't make those payments. It's now important to see how do we get to the point out of here so that when the board is gone, we don't go back to those 16 years, right, of revenues being less than how much you are spending. That is the turning point of where we are with this fiscal plan, because hopefully PREPA bank will be out of Title III. That plan will be confirmed. And now we have to figure out how do we make sure that the finances going forward are being managed correctly, and we have economic growth so that more revenues are coming in so that you can continue spending more. This budget has a 3% spending increase in it. That is the result of fiscal discipline and the revenues performing better than we had anticipated. It's a dividend, and that dividend is now being used for properly spent in the areas that we think need additional spending. The governor has identified those areas. We agreed with many of those areas, and that is what you'll see in the budget. But we have to remember kind of where we got here, because fundamentally how you manage the budget has to change. The legislature, even after the fiscal year closes on June 30th, begins on July 1, that's the end of that's the budget, and we finish a budget hopefully by June 30th. That's the budget for the year. That's not the practice here. The practice here is budget's done, and then they continue passing bills that spend money, reduce taxes, or do other things that impact the overall financial plan. That means that the budget is not really ever closed. That means that you have this open thing that's happening all the time. The budget should be the budget. And then if you have additional needs that may happen, which could happen, it's a discussion of identifying revenues, not pass it, and we'll figure it out later. Now, after PROMESA, as I said, there's been a dividend. So there's been talk in the past about the reductions that have been in the budget. And there was a time where the budgets had to reflect the reality of the amount of revenues. Last year's budget did not have reductions. This year's budget, as I mentioned, doesn't have reductions, it actually has increases. But it also is important to note some of the increases that we have made over the years cumulative, because there have been investments that are made, and that's part of managing the resources properly. $2.5 billion was invested in retirement to make sure that you could actually pay the retirements of the retirees, right? Retirements are promises that you make to the retirees. As a result of the bankruptcy, those promises were not able to be fulfilled. Working with the government, we identified $2.5 billion that are there to make sure that those promises we're committing them for the future. Almost $1 billion in capital expenditures for healthcare facilities. We recognize that more needs to be done in the healthcare space, but let's not forget what has been done. It has not been all right sizing of a budget. Almost $1 billion in salary increases for teachers, for school staff, and the creation of new positions. $740 million for salary increases for the police officers, because the government recognized that it's important. And as a result of the bankruptcy, we couldn't make those kinds of investments. $450 million to invest in broadband and providing technical skills for the workforce in the future. Last year, we increased by 20% the amount available to the University of Puerto Rico. It's not to go back to the old ways. The university still has challenges, But the point was to say, we recognize that we need to invest in the institution. We want that institution to be back to where it once was. But those dollars need to be tied to changes and reforms that reflect the reality and reflect a new economy and how the university can be part of growing Puerto Rico out of post-bankruptcy, out of Title III. The Earned Income Tax Program. It is probably one of the largest tax cuts in the history of Puerto Rico. Next year alone, it will be about $1.3 billion. Since it was enacted, $4.9 billion. It's costing more than we projected it to cost. We only projected it to cost $800 million a year. It is now 1.3. Some could say that's a success. The point is that that money is going to almost 600,000 taxpayers in Puerto Rico. That's money that we collect. It's being returned to the people. It has happened as we've been in Title III and moved out of Title III. We have $730 million in new initiatives for the current year, which is part of the 3% increase, which generally we'll talk about later. Another $300 million in capital investments that are in this budget for next year, that is part of the governor's budget. And as I mentioned earlier, $250 million in tax rebates to go to under 150,000 families. And then as part of civil service reform, we're investing $250 million in the government of the current employees and the future to make sure that we have the right skill sets to manage the government going forward. So in addition, we've made targeted investments, and these investments are for long-term growth. That's what we have done. Here's where we are moving forward. We need to invest in human capital. We recognize that. We need to invest in social welfare, the EITC. There's efforts regarding SNAP and the NAP work requirements here, workforce development programs. As I mentioned, the tax rebate, K-12 education. Puerto Rico receives enormous amount of money from the federal government with regard to K-12 education. Those dollars need to be managed better. We also receive an enormous amount, over $4 billion in one-time funds. Those funds are being used for operating. Those funds are going to go away. And we need to make sure, one, we're planning for it because those are one time. And we still can grow out of it. K-12, we have to recognize that there's a demographic change in the number of students in K-12. So all of these things are part of that conversation, but it doesn't mean that we need to invest necessarily more dollars here, but we need to manage the dollars that we have here and then do an assessment of what more is needed. And as I mentioned, we are actively working with the government, with stakeholders, with the governing board and the administration at UPR to make sure that there's a path forward for additional investment, but those additional investments are put in the right places so that the university is growing again. Sustained fiscal responsibility requires long-lasting financial management practices and sustainable growth. That means that it is not just the board working with the government and then the board working with the legislature and sometimes us saying no. We need to make sure that these practices are permanent. You know, I did this for a long time. I had a lot of rules in place. There are many things that I could and couldn't do when I was managing a budget. Many of those things they prevent irresponsible things from happening. They prevent irresponsible things happening from the executive side. They prevent them from happening from the legislature. Many of those limitations, those guardrails, don't exist. That process needs to be reformed. We need to have a budget reform and processes in place that prevent fiscal mismanagement from happening. There will always be ways to be, irresponsible, but you can put guardrails in place. You can put things in place to make sure that it doesn't happen in a post-board environment. And that is where we are right now. We've been working closely with the executive, working closely with the budget office to put together a plan for administrative changes and looking forward also to potentially legislative changes so that Going forward, it is a different kind of a budget process, one that doesn't allow for unfettered spending, and it doesn't allow for the 16 years that were the beginning of this century. We need to have a capital delivery plan for each agency. This is something that's the best practice. It's the practice in everywhere else. You need a capital plan. You need to know long-term how much you're going to spend. You need to know where those dollars are going to come from. And you need to know how long it is going to take. Puerto Rico is going to have the return to the capital markets. And you're going to need to know how much do you need? When do you need it? And how are you going to pay for it when you need it? Right now, because of the federal reconstruction dollars, most of the money that you would need for the capital from the debt capital markets would be for infrastructure investment. The federal dollars are doing a lot of the infrastructure investment presently. But again, those will wane, but it gives you a great opportunity to lay the foundation for a capital plan. This is the capital plan that we're going to need, because you need capital plans for 20 years out. I used to do capital plans that were, 20 years long. You have to identify the resources, but you know where they are. They can change because things change, but that is the discipline that is fiscal responsibility. And it all needs to be transparent. It all needs to be public. It all needs to be available for everyone to see and open to scrutiny. And that's okay. On the economic growth side, we need a framework for economic growth going forward. A lot has changed. The world has changed. Capital markets have changed. The economies have changed. And there's no economists that have the right answers. And a lot of them will say things are changing, and they're changing very rapidly. Puerto Rico needs to be prepared to deal with those changes and figure out its role, how it best fits into a changing global economy, and how we can progress in the future. And again, we have an extraordinary opportunity to do that while we are using the federal dollars, which are currently running through our economy at $10 billion projected in this year alone. Everyone needs to work together. This is not a partisan issue. This is about how do we grow? How do we create jobs? How do we create an environment where even the people that left want to return to Puerto Rico, because there is opportunity on the island, and you're only going to have it by having jobs and creating growth and long-term growth, or a plan for long-term growth. So, as I mentioned, the budget reform will require, and this will, as we move forward, robust financial management and oversight practices. So revenue forecasting process has to be improved. These are never perfect. You're always going to get it wrong. I used to say it's just a matter of, who's less wrong on these things, and they change. But there needs to be an open and transparent process with regards to revenue forecasting, and the previous 16 years that didn't exist. Budget best practices, working with the budget office to figure out what are the best practices, how can we best manage money, how can we follow cash, how do we develop capital plans going forward? How do we manage the education resources? How do we work with labor? How do we negotiate salary increases in a responsible way that fits within the budget and is not based on politics? It has to be based on merits, on skills, and doing forward. And we've been doing that. We're working with the governor right now on civil service reform. That has been happening. But again, the tendency is to roll back. So we have to make sure that it's permanent. Healthcare system is having challenges. There's not a day that's going by that you don't hear about it. We need to just focus on it and make sure that we have the resources to make investments to the extent we need it. And that is the point right now. We're at that point where we do have resources. We have to figure out where it can properly go. Transparency and reporting is something the government is doing now, and we need to do more, and we need to recognize the role of the municipalities and how they can partner with the government on delivering services. So we're going to work on a comprehensive capital program with the governor, multi-year capital plans going forward. This is something that is the next step going forward. And I know that there's a lot of, it's an issue of bandwidth sometimes, because you're also trying to deliver all of the federal reconstruction dollars and get those out as quickly as possible. But we need to make sure that there's something in place for how we plan going forward. This is what, every entity does. Every municipality should be doing this. Every state does this. This is how you can manage going forward and make sure that you're using the capital markets for what you need, and you're instilling confidence in the capital markets that you have a plan and you have the resources to go forward. And the economic growth initiatives, as I mentioned, we need an overall economic growth plan that works underneath the federal dollars that we're spending that right now are contributing and floating the economy going forward. We look forward to working with the administration on this, as we move forward. But the plan overall is right now, the debt restructurings are largely gone, are largely over. Hopefully PREPA gets confirmed. Now we need to make sure that we have the long-term financial best practices in place. Promesa was clear on one thing that ran throughout the statute: fiscal responsibility and long-term fiscal responsibility. And the requirements for the board on having balanced budgets, the requirements from the board on having access to the capital markets, all of those things relate that to the theme of fiscal responsibility. And this fiscal plan is about that going forward. So we look forward, working with the government on making sure that we can achieve all of the things in this fiscal plan. Thank you.